You're going to learn how to purl by making everybody's favourite thing, yes, a tension square. The tension for project 4 is 16 stitches by 23 rows, so cast on 4 more stitches than you need, that's 20. Pop your row counter on the end of the empty needle, or download the tick-off sheet or use a digital row counter. After you've cast on your stitches, the first thing you'll actually do is knit the first row. And this is because we're creating our swatch in stocking stitch, which means to knit a row and then purl a row. Knit and purl are almost always used together, so if you're knitting, you'll usually be purling too. There are exceptions, like when working in garter stitch, like you did for the first 3 projects. I always say once you can knit, you can purl, and once you can purl, you can do pretty much anything. So here we go, I'm going to teach you how to purl on row 2. After you finish row 1, it will look very similar to a regular row 1 when working in garter stitch. Once you've finished knitting it, move your row counter up, or tick it off, and then turn the needle around. Row 2 is an even row, and in stocking stitch the even rows will always be purl rows. So if you're not sure if you're working an odd or even row, just check where that cast on tail is. If it's on the right, you're about to work an even row, which is a purl row. With purling, one of the most important things is to make sure that the yarn is being pulled towards you. Unlike the knit stitch where the yarn is behind the needles, with purl stitch it will be at the front. Like with the knit stitch, you need to find the stitch above the bumps, and you can pull the yarn coming from the ball to find out where that is on the first stitch. Now this is where it's all going to change, and it's different from knitting. You want to take the right needle and push it through the stitch from the back to the front. So you're coming in the opposite way to the knit stitch, and the right needle will now crisscross over the left. This is different to the knit stitch, because with the knit stitch you've been pushing that needle from the front to the back, where with purl you're going to be pushing it through the back to the front of that front part of the stitch on the left needle. Purling isn't like a KFB, so you're not going into the back of that stitch, you're just going through the stitch from the back to the front. Then you want to take the yarn coming from the ball, don't accidentally use the tail, and wrap it around the right needle tip anti-clockwise. Now this is why the yarn needs to be at the front of the work. Pull that wrapped yarn so it sits naturally between the 2 needles, so like with the knit stitch, make sure it's not too loose and it's not too tight. So remember, with the purl stitch, wrap that yarn anti-clockwise around the needle. Hold the yarn over your left index finger to pull it slightly tighter, as this will make the process easier. Then using your left thumb, push the right needle tip down and away from you so it catches the wrapped yarn, and be careful not to lose the wrapped yarn when doing this. This creates a new stitch on the right needle, and then all you have to do is slide it off, transferring it from the left to the right needle. And that's it, you've purled. You've purled your first stitch on row 2. Remember I said having the yarn at the front of the needles is really important, so you need to make sure it's always at the front of the needles and not at the back like with knitting. You need to purl the next stitch, so once again you're working those stitches above the bumps. Push your right needle from the back to the front of the stitch on the left so that it crisscrosses over the left needle. Then you want to wrap the yarn coming from the ball anti-clockwise around the right needle tip, so it's almost like the opposite of knitting. Using your left thumb, push that right needle down and away from you, so it catches the wrapped yarn, making a new stitch on the right needle. Once you've done that, slide the stitch from the left to the right needle so you've transferred it over, and then repeat the steps again. Push the right needle through the stitch from the back to the front, wrap the yarn around anti-clockwise, and using your thumb, push that right needle down and away from you so it catches the stitch. And this can be the trickiest thing with purl, So like with the knit stitch, if you don't push it down and away from you, it won't catch the stitch. But if this happens, you can just try again. Don't forget you can use pages 60 and 61 of First Time Knits to go through the photo step-by-steps for purl. I'll go through them slowly again. Push your right needle tip through the stitch on the left needle from the back to the front. Then wrap the yarn coming from the ball around the right needle tip anti-clockwise. And using your thumb, push the right needle tip down and away from you so it catches the wrapped yarn, making a new stitch. Then slide the stitch off the needle, transferring it from the left to the right. And repeat for every purl stitch. So push the right needle in from the back to the front, wrap the yarn around, and then using your thumb, push the right needle tip down and away from you and slide the stitch off the left needle. Remember, when you're purling, you're going in the opposite way to the knit stitch, so you need to make sure that you know your difference between your knit and your purl stitches. But don't worry, you're going to get loads of practice in by making your tension square. Purl every stitch on this row, and you're always making sure that that yarn is pulled towards you. If the yarn is at the back of the work, like with the knit stitch, and you try and purl, you're going to accidentally add an extra stitch. So make sure when purling that that yarn is always facing towards you. If you need those purl steps, here they are again. Push the right needle through the stitch from the back to the front. Wrap the yarn around the right needle tip anti-clockwise. Push the right needle down and away from you using your left thumb and slide the stitch off the left needle, transferring it to the right. And that's all that purl is. I know a lot of people will make a bit of a fuss about purl and they're a bit scared of it, but it's actually really easy because once you've mastered how to do the knit stitch, you're taking those basic actions and using them in a different way for purl. You need to purl every stitch on this row, and you can always rewind the video back to the beginning to see me going over the steps slowly. You can always pause the video and then rejoin me when you reach the end of your row 2, which is your purl row. Like with the knit stitch, try and keep your hand movements small. You can start by making big ones as you learn, but the more you purl, the smaller you can make those hand movements and the easier it will be to do it. So there we go, that's row 2 purled. This is the first time you've purled, so the first time you've purled is on row 2. And I know it's row 2 because my cast on tail is on the right of the piece. So I'll quickly move my row counter up to row 2 to celebrate the first purl row. What you'll notice about this row is that it's bumpy on the back, so at this point it looks quite a lot like garter stitch, but actually it's really different. When you turn the knitting needle around, what you'll notice is that all the bumps have disappeared. So because we purled on that row, we've created smooth stitches on the right side. And this is different to garter stitch because garter stitch has those ridges going all the way along the fabric. With stocking stitch, that's not going to happen, but you won't really see that change until we've worked a few more rows. The next row is a K row, so you need to knit all the stitches on this row. I know it's a knit row because the cast on tail is on the left side. Like I mentioned before, these stitches are now smooth, so there's no bump to knit over. With garter stitch, we were always knitting above the bumps, that was the key rule, but with stocking stitch on the knit row, there is no bump, so you just need to knit into the front of that stitch as per usual. The only difference is it's now smooth. Make sure that you do the knit stitch on this row, so pushing the right needle through the front of the stitch, wrapping the yarn around the needle from the back to the front, then using your left index finger to push the needle down and towards you so it catches the stitch, and then slide it off the needle. What you'll start seeing as you knit these stitches is that those smooth ones below them become more apparent. So every time you do a knit stitch, you're building on that fabric, and what you'll see is it's actually creating a smooth texture on the right side of the work. Now that you've finished row 3, so you've worked 3 rows in a stocking stitch, that's 1 knitted row, 1 purl row and 1 more knitted row, you can start to see that smooth fabric forming on the right side of the work. The stitches that you've made look different to garter stitch. They look like smooth V's, not bumpy ridges. That's the main difference when you start working in knit and purl. It's going to change the shape of the fabric. The right side is smooth and the stitches now have this V-shaped appearance. And when you turn the work around, it's all bumpy, so it almost looks like garter stitch, but it's not. It's actually called reverse stocking stitch, which isn't the most imaginative name, but it is accurate. After you've knitted a row, then you're onto a purl row. So this is an even row, which is the wrong side of the work. So you need to purl this row. This is the second row that we're going to purl. So you're going to repeat what you did for row 2 on row 4. As this row has bumps, you need to make sure that you purl above those bumps. So you can start by pulling the yarn coming from the ball to find the first stitch. Remember, as it's a purl stitch, the yarn needs to be facing towards you, not behind the needles. That's really important. Push the needle from the back to the front of the stitch on the left, so you're pushing it the opposite way to the knit stitch. Then wrap the yarn anti-clockwise around the right needle tip, so it sits between both needles. And then using your left thumb, push the right needle down and away from you, and then slide the stitch off the left needle. With purl stitch, it's really important that you go into those stitches above the bumps. Like I mentioned with the knit stitch, if you go under the bumps, you're going to accidentally add a new stitch on the needles. So always purl above the bumps. So I've run through those purl steps again for you on this row, and I'm going to whiz through it as I want to talk a bit more about the right side and the wrong side when I get to the end of the row. If you need any extra help, you can head to page 64 of First Time Knits to see how my knitters got on and what mistakes they made. Now that you've finished row 4, you can really see that fabric starting to build. So this is the wrong side of the work, the reverse stocking stitch side. It's really bumpy, but as you know, it's not like garter stitch. Garter stitch has those ridges and it's fully reversible, so the ridges are on both sides. They kind of look similar, but they are really different. If you were to purl every row, so casting on and working every stitch in purl on every row, you'd actually create garter stitch. It's when knitting and purling together that you change the fabric to stocking stitch. So you'll have that bumpy purl side, which looks a bit like garter stitch, but it isn't, and then that smooth right side. So when you turn the work, that's when you'll notice the real difference with stocking stitch. These smooth stitches look completely different to garter stitch, as there's no bumpy ridges running through the right side of the fabric. Next up is a knit row, but you knew that already, didn't you? Because you've worked the basics of stocking stitch. If you've got a smooth side facing you, you're about to work a knit row, and in this case it will be row 5. If the bumpy side is facing towards you, you're on an even row, which is a purl row, so you need to purl that row. For your tension square, you need to work 28 rows in stocking stitch. So knitting a row and then purling a row and then knitting a row and then purling a row and then knitting a row and purling a row and knitting a row and purling a row, knitting a row and purling a row, knitting a row, and so on. Here's how your piece of knitting will look after you've worked 28 rows in stocking stitch. So this is the right side of the work where I've been knitting, and you can see I've got loads of those smooth stitches. On the wrong side of the work, it's all bumpy, and you can see it's kind of curled up, and that's one of the big things about stocking stitch is that it curls. When you've knitted your 28 rows, it's time to cast off. So to cast off, you just cast off using the same steps as with garter stitch. But what's really important with stocking stitch is that you cast off on the right side of the work. So unless a pattern tells you to cast off on the wrong side, the purl side, you need to make sure you're casting off on the smooth side. So here I am casting off using the same steps that I taught you in Project 1. The only real difference is those stitches that you're knitting into and casting off over are smooth, so there's no bumps. Once you've cast off, you'll have finished your tension square, and that's it. You've worked in stocking stitch for 28 rows, so that's 28 rows of knitting and purling. And all that's left to do is measure it, and you can head to my next video to see how to do that.